Hello, welcome to Can't Make This Up. My name's Kevin, I'm your host. This is a podcast where I get to sit down with historians and journalists and authors and talk about their latest work, their latest research. Today is a special episode though. Instead of a historian, I'm talking with a historical novelist. My guest today is Brianna Labuskes, who has written a book that just came out called The Librarian of Burned Books. In this novel, set in the 1930s and 40s, her protagonists are involved in combating the practice of banning reading or burning books and trying to preserve knowledge and preserve written works. Very timely book, given some of the recent interest in banning certain materials. And so I thought this would be a really interesting, timely discussion to have. Brianna and we talk about her book and her protagonist, but also what was some of the motivation and what was some of the practices of book bans and book burns in the 1930s and 40s, both abroad in Nazi Germany, but also here at home in the United States. So I hope that you'll enjoy this episode and learn something new.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Well, you're listening to Can't Make This Up. My guest today is Brianna Labuskes. Brianna, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing? I'm excited to be here.
Oh, very good. For starters, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got started being a novelist.
Sure. I started my career as a journalist, actually. I really loved the idea of free speech and free press. So I was really, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about the First Amendment, which I think you kind of see carry into this current book. So I spent about 10 years covering small local papers. And then I worked in DC covering politics there, which also creeps into this book a little bit. I loved it in my 20s. I thought it was so much fun to cover all of the important going-ons on Capitol Hill. But then you start getting a little tired of
I can imagine that would wear you down after a while.
It does a little bit inside the Beltway. Christmas Eve deadlines that don't mean anything. Just senators trying to, make some sound bites. So anyways, I kind of started looking to go into different types of writing, and I'd always wanted to write a book. So I tried my hand at it and ended up kind of loving it and really finding a lot of satisfaction in it. So the rest ended up being history after that.
Okay, so the book we're going to talk about today, which I think is your fifth?
I think it's my eighth.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm sorry.
No worries. I sometimes lose track. Yeah, I think it's my eighth. Yes.
Okay. The book we're going to talk about today is a historical fiction novel, The Librarian of Burned Books, which many listeners might find is a bit timely.
Yeah.
Given recent developments. So I guess for starters, what's your couple-minute elevator pitch about what your book's about?
So the pulse beat of this book is about the Armed Services editions, which were lightweight paperback books that the government sent to soldiers serving overseas to kind of alleviate boredom, boost morale. And there was a censorship fight involved with these books. This powerful senator wanted to limit which titles could be sent to soldiers, and essentially it was just this broad overreach political play for essentially the White House. He had his eye on the White House. And so I have a young woman who kind of takes this on as her hill to die on, and she goes up against the senator and tries to get him to remove this amendment. And while doing that, she stumbles upon these other women's stories. One who was an American writer in Berlin in 1933 during the book burnings, and then one in 1936 Paris, where this librarian worked at a library that was devoted entirely to preserving the books that the Nazis wanted to burn. So that's kind of where the title comes from, the Librarian of Burned Books. And so all of their fates kind of collide into this cinematic finale at the end against the senator. So yeah.
Okay, and so this title, if you were the librarian of burned books, is kind of a role of stewarding that goes from person to person to person.
There are multiple kind of guardians of these banned books. There was a second library in Brooklyn that also existed to protect the burned books, and I think you could kind of consider Viv someone who protects free speech and burn books and stuff. So I do think the title ends up being, you're right, like a bigger umbrella for all of the women involved.
So these women in three different places in three different times dealing with the issue of banning and burning books. When you started doing research and grounding this in this fictional story in some real world history, what did you discover about the history of banning books?
That it has existed since there have been books.
Okay.
Which, like it kind of makes me hopeful. I think that I'm hoping readers take a little bit of hope out of that. It's so scary right now, like you alluded to. We're having some of the same issues. But for example, there was a couple big censorship fights during World War II in the United States. So there were a couple censorship fights in the United States going on during World War II, which was so fascinating to me because so much of the propaganda during that time period revolved around the idea that fascists burned books and banned books. And, during World War II, we had this like huge sweep of patriotism going through, and you had to get the home front behind the war. And so even though we had a strong fascist movement in the 30s, you did see kind of, Hitler, the Nazis, they're terrible. Like, these are the monsters. And yet, and the reason one of the reasons they're monsters is they burn and ban books. And yet here we are banning and burning books in America. And so I just like kind of found that the mental gymnastics behind that really fascinating. And just disheartening in some ways and heartening in others, just that we do keep having these fights, but books keep winning in the end. So far, knock on wood. And so that's one of the things I like most about history is that you can see these patterns and you can see how people have always been people, for better or worse. And the idea of controlling knowledge and controlling what people consume for entertainment, and people consume for research, etc., has always been like a go-to, even when it's associated with the worst of the worst that you can imagine. And so that's kind of one of the patterns you kind of see emerge when you start researching, especially in the 20th century, burning and banning books.
So it seems to be if anybody puts their ideas to paper, somebody is going to hate it and want to try to get rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think maybe that can be a good thing sometimes. Like, if everybody loves your book, right? Like, then maybe you didn't say something important. I don't know.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look
Yeah.
at all the classic great books that, we kind of commonly accept as these are books that are really worth reading, most of them were banned or censored at some point in their history.
Absolutely. Like, you go to any bookshop that has like a featured banned books bookshelf, and they're like the best books in the world. And people are just uncomfortable with ideas that challenge their worldview. And then they're like, okay, we got to burn it or ban it or whatever. Instead of just thinking about it critically. I mean, I know I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. But it makes you kind of see just the patterns throughout history just repeat themselves for sure.
So the books that your characters guard and try to preserve, are there any themes or are there any certain type books that were being targeted that your protagonists were trying to save?
One of those themes that you're going to see is having echoes of today is queer books, queer research. Most importantly, in 1933, one of the first places that the burnings, I don't know if people know this, but the burnings were held by students, which I also found very fascinating. But
So it wasn't the government, it was students saying we
it
don't.
was students, yeah. I mean, it was kind of
Wow.
in partnership with like Goebbels and stuff. And he spoke, uh, but it was led by students. And I think that kind of highlights the way that some of these movements camouflage themselves in almost intellectualism in a different, like in a way that we're getting rid of degenerate stuff. And this is the pure stuff. And it's almost, it's so sneaky almost in a way, because you're like, oh, these students are doing it. So of course, like they prize intellectualism, they prize knowledge. Of course, they wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't, good. And I think it lends little credibility that just isn't there. So anyways, one of the first places they raided to get these books to burn on May 10th, 1933 was this institute that was like decades ahead of its time on studying queerness, on studying women, on transgender issues, all of that stuff. And they burned this research that was one of a kind. And so you see a lot of that obviously happening again, and that being a target. And I just think it's an easy target. Of course, with Jewish authors and writers as well, any kind of minority that they wanted to create into a scapegoat for everybody else's problems. I guess you just kind of see that over and over again, and you get these people who are not in, who are minority groups being targeted over and over again, just because it's easy. It's easy to do.
Sure. I mean, most of the population probably won't stick their neck out for this small.
Yeah, exactly. Like that, that famous World War II quote where it's like they came for these people, they came for these people, and they came for me. So it just kind of, that 1933, especially, they were still coming just for like the outside group where you're not gonna fight for them if you don't see yourself as part of that group. So I got off of my soapbox a little bit there. I'm sorry.
That's okay though, because
Yeah.
I mean, I think if anybody in the audience, I consider myself one of these people who reads a lot, likes knowledge, likes learning. This practice is really offensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote this book in 2020. And so it hadn't really reached the fever pitch yet that it's kind of at now. I mean, I hope it's the fever pitch. I hope it doesn't go there.
That was going to be one of my questions, is when did you
Yeah.
start writing this? Because there's no way that you put out a novel in the last, 6 months that this has been a big issue.
No, I think and what I've been saying is like the drum beats of fascism are so consistent. And you could see it happening. You could see the beginnings of it. I think there was a little bit of people are panicking for no reason or whatever, but if you pay attention to history and you watch the steps that the Nazis took, any kind of authoritarian shift from a really healthy Germany was like a fledgling democracy, let's say, but it still had, voters and people were allowed to give their opinions and stuff. So a democracy into fascism is kind of a very predictable slide. And so, like I said, I'm super into the First Amendment. I'm super into books and protecting, fighting against censorship. And so I could kind of see the whispers of it happening. I could see the beginnings, and I was just like, I got to write this book right now. And then like by the day it became more relevant.
Which I'm sure just gave you motivation to hurry up and make sure you got it done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Just
So,
it's sad to watch, just because, I had immersed myself so much in the research on, especially these libraries that, popped into existence. To the one in Paris came about because this group of German Jewish emigres who lived in Paris were just trying to warn everybody about this fascism that was going on, and Hitler, and trying to stop what they saw was coming. And so they created this pamphlet essentially that was like anti-fascism, but they had collected all these samples, and they're like, well, what do we do with like the rest of this, like newspapers and articles and books? And so that's why how they created the library of Nazi banned books. Yeah. Burned books, sorry, Nazi burned books over there. So yeah, just like seeing that and like knowing that there's a lot of people who want to be like, look, this is important and scary right now. It's just kind of, it's hard to study history sometimes.
yes, it can be.
Yeah.
Hi, I hope that you're enjoying this episode from Can't Make This Up. I wanted to take a short break from our conversation today to tell you about a new little side project that I've started to go alongside of the podcast. I have opened an Etsy shop called Gifts for History Nerds, where I am creating humorous, history-themed coffee mugs and other items using some iconic imagery from history. I hope that you'll check it out. You can find a link to the Etsy shop, Gifts for History Nerds, down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. And then if you peruse the collection and you see something that you like, feel free to enter the promo code CMTUHistory to get 10% off. All right, well, now back to my conversation with today's guests. But you found some inspiring figures in the real world, and then you've created some for your novel who didn't accept this, and they fought back. So
Yeah.
what were some of the things that your characters and people in real history did to fight back against this destruction of literature?
I think just make sure that do everything in their power to increase access to these books. This isn't part of the book, but for example, like booksellers in Germany, after the Nazis banned certain titles, we'd like keep them under the cash register, like for people. It was like a whisper book club network, essentially, of like, where can I get this banned book? And I think
so there was a black market for books.
yeah, there was.
Wow.
I didn't manage to squeeze that one in there, but I just think that people who have always, who cherish books, who cherish knowledge, who cherish, different ideas and empathy and all of this stuff, I think they create, even if it's not libraries, access in certain ways, just providing ways that people can learn. Like the library in Paris actually carried Nazi newspapers. It carried Mein Kampf. It carried philosophers of Nazism, because they wanted people to realize like what these Nazis were saying, and that they weren't pacifists, and they weren't isolationists, and they were like gunning to take over Europe. And so like even access to, and what the enemy is saying and what they're talking about was really important. So I think that was a big part of it. Viv's fight. So the the woman who's going up against the senator, I made her one character, but she represents the fight from the Council on Books in Wartime, which existed essentially to promote use books to win the war on ideas, which was their slogan. It sounds like such a slogan. But they did radio programs, and they recommended certain books for all Americans to read to kind of have the right ideas, which is a little borderline, right? But they were a great organization, Council on Books in Wartime, and they really did launch this like huge campaign against the senator. They pulled it, they, talked to newspapers, and they got editorials written, and they really tried to win over the public and show just how scary these ideas can be. And so I think, that's another form of access, isn't it? I think my main point keeps coming back to that, to provide access to people.
We live in a world of whataboutism. And I could see somebody looking at this issue, what happened in the 30s and 40s, what's happening today, and say, well, what about cancel culture? What about, people who've lost their careers because of things they've said and things like that? Can you maybe make a distinction between what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest frustrations of kind of the current censorship debate, to me, is the misunderstanding of the First Amendment, or the over-application of the First Amendment. Censorship is about government, it's government saying what books you can't read. And that's really, except for the burnings in early in the 33, everything else is the government saying you can't read these books. It was a senator who was saying these are books that aren't appropriate for the soldiers, and it was Hitler saying these books you can't read them. And so I think that point, that people who know better, that's what frustrates me. People who know better, who have been to, Harvard Law School or Yale Law School, and they make the idea of, and they conflate the idea of censorship and popular pushback. If your book, you have no right for your book to be popular. You have no right to say something heinous and not get pushback from that. You have a right to be able to buy a book that the government can't tell you can't do that. And so I think, to me, that's the intrinsic difference, is you don't just get to say offensive things, or you don't get to write offensive things and not have people say, hey, this is offensive. You get to do that and not have the government say you can't.
Sure. There's a big difference if a group of people who are, offended and dislike a book decide to boycott it, versus I'm in Ohio, the example, state of Ohio says you cannot but purchase this in our state.
Yeah. And I'm from Pennsylvania. They're doing the same thing. Florida is the obvious example of schools not being able to put books on their shelves. And I think one of the gray areas you start getting into, I guess, is these PACs or political action groups having this really loud voice. And so they're not the government, they're just citizens saying these books are terrible, and then they end up having influence on the government. So it's kind of starts to blur a little bit. But if you want to go buy a book and then burn it, I guess do it. But don't. But if someone else says they're not going to buy the book that you want everyone reading, don't call it censorship. I also think it's funny that the author will get royalties from that one.
And you see that every once in a while, where someone they'll buy a copy and then they'll burn it, and everyone kind of shrugs their shoulders and, oh well.
Yeah. Or Nikes or Starbucks or whatever.
Sure.
Whatever the popular boycott is of the day. But it's funny.
When I used to work at a bookstore, Books A Million, and I swear half my job was I'd have to go through and flip around all the book covers that people didn't like, because they'd flip them upside down or backward.
Stop. Oh my gosh. What a way to spend your time.
After you have a reader read through your novel, what's your main hope for your readers as this book comes out?
I think to understand that there are kind of different levels of politics. And Althea was a really important character to me because she starts out as naive and not really paying attention to politics. She doesn't really think it affects her. And I have, I've had friends like that who are like, I just don't think about it. And it's such a privilege, right? Like not to think about it. And which is fine. I think everyone's busy with their lives. We live such hectic lives. Like you cannot pay attention the way I did when I was covering them. Like every, burp on Capitol Hill gets covered. But there are times when there are things that are bigger than just the back and forth and the debt ceiling, blah, blah, blah. There are times when it's, our actual society, our actual government is sliding out of democracy and into fascism, and there's a time to really pay attention and really make your voice heard, even if you never thought you could be that person. And I think what I'd want people, I kind of want people to come out with a little bit of a fighting spirit, and that their books are really worth defending. And if we get complacent about this, it's only going to get worse. And so I hope they come out of it with a little bit of hope, a little bit of fight, and a little bit of some self-reflection on like what they can do as part of this bigger movement.
Well, Brianna, your passion for this subject is obvious. So,
That's a very diplomatic way of being like, you're on a soapbox.
no, not at all. I
Okay.
think you're passionate, like you said, about the First Amendment, about access, about literacy, and it comes across. So I encourage people to read your book.
Oh, thank you so much.
And please don't burn it, right? Or at least pay for
Buy
it.
Buy it first.
All right. Brianna, if someone does want to pick up a copy of your book or learn more about you and your other work, where can they go?
BriannaLabuskes.com. If you can Google like an approximation of even that, it'll probably come up. I have a fairly unique name.
All right, perfect. Brianna, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I had fun.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and listening to my conversation with Brianna Labuskes. Big thank you to Brianna for taking the time to talk with me. That was an excellent conversation. I had a ton of fun. If you want to pick up a copy of The Librarian of Burned Books, there's a link to it down in the description of this episode that'll kick you over to indiebound.org, where you can find a copy at your nearest independent bookshop. Support those local booksellers. Or there's a link to the Libro.fm audiobook, where it's very nicely narrated by 3 different narrators, actually, for each of Brianna's characters. All right, well, that's it for today. We got some stuff coming down the pipeline here soon. I've got a conversation with Simon Garfield and his book about the history of the encyclopedia. We are also going to be having an episode where I talk to Dr. Janina Ramirez about her book Femina, about some of the lesser-known heroines and notable women from the medieval period who really shaped medieval society, but were unfortunately left out of the popular record. And then lastly, just recently had a conversation with Alexander Larman about his upcoming book. This is a little later. This is in April. It'll be coming out in April, but his book, The Windsors at War, about the British royal family in the years before and during World War II. So a lot of fun stuff to look forward to. If you're new around here, I hope that you've enjoyed your first episode and you'll come back. Be sure to follow the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or wherever you're listening. Subscribe, of course. And if you've been around a while and you enjoy listening to the podcast, would you consider giving me a review? Hopefully it's a 5-star review, but if not, that's okay too. I'd love to hear your perspective and love to see some feedback. So one last thing, if you would like to follow the show on social media, I post fairly frequently, at least on Twitter and sometimes on TikTok, but I'm on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all of them at CMTU History, if you'd like to connect. So until next time, see you then.